The fence post shouldn't have been hollow. That was the first thing Wyatt Mercer noticed, and Wyatt Mercer noticed everything. What he pulled from the ground that morning wasn't just rotted cedar. It was a secret 30 years in the making. Hidden beneath a crumbling ranch fence stretched across the Wyoming prairie lay something that powerful men had buried, lied about, and threatened lives to keep covered. Land had been stolen, records had been forged, and the only person who could prove it was a quiet fence builder who almost didn't take the job. If you've ever wondered how one ordinary man can change everything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The job came to Wyatt Mercer on a Tuesday, which was unusual because nothing good ever seemed to happen to him on Tuesdays. He was sitting in the gravel lot outside Harlan's Feed and Supply in Garnet Creek, Wyoming, eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like the plastic it came wrapped in, when Cal Briggs pulled up in a dust-caked Silverado and rolled down his window without cutting the engine. That was Cal's way of letting you know the conversation wasn't going to last long. "You still taking fence work?" Cal asked. "Depends on the fence." Wyatt folded the sandwich wrapper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He had a thing about litter. "Old Harmon place, out on Route 9 past the Sulphur Creek turnoff. Nobody's touched it in about 6 years. Owner died, estate's been in limbo. New buyer finally closed last month. Wants the perimeter assessed, damaged sections replaced. Probably 2-3 weeks of work." Wyatt knew the Harmon place. Everybody in Garnet Creek knew the Harmon place, even if most people had stopped talking about it. The ranch sat on about 400 acres of mixed prairie and scrubland, edged along its eastern boundary by a long-dead cattle corridor that used to connect 3 ranches to the grazing commons before the Dillard family bought up most of the middle land in the 90s and started running it like a private kingdom. The Harmon property had been in a quiet, grinding dispute with the Dillards for as long as Wyatt could remember. Something about a boundary line, something about access rights, something that had poisoned every interaction between the 2 neighboring properties for at least 2 generations. He'd heard fragments of it over the years. Most people in small ranch country eventually heard fragments of everything. "Who's the new buyer?" Wyatt asked. "Margaret Voss. She's from Billings. Bought it sight mostly unseen from what I understand. Wants to run cattle again eventually. Right now she just wants the fence in order." Wyatt thought about it for about 4 seconds. He was between jobs. The sandwich was bad. The lot smelled like diesel and fertilizer. "What's the rate?" he asked. Cal told him. It was fair, not generous, but fair. "All right," Wyatt said. He drove out to the Harmon place the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. He liked arriving at a new property early, before anyone else was around, because the land told you things in the quiet that it wouldn't bother telling you once people started moving around on it and making noise. He parked his truck at the end of the gravel lane and walked the perimeter without touching anything for the first hour, just looking. The fence was in bad shape. Not catastrophic. Nothing had completely fallen down. But neglect had done its work steadily over 6 years. Several cedar posts had rotted at the base. A stretch along the northwest corner had heaved out of the ground during frost cycles, tilting at angles that made the wire sag. The eastern fence line, the long straight run that bordered what used to be the cattle corridor and now bordered Dillard land, was the oldest section by far. The posts there were a different style, a different era. Thicker, hand-squared rather than milled round, sunk deeper into the ground. Whoever built that section had built it to last. He started in the northwest corner where the damage was worst and worked his way around. The first 2 days were straightforward. Pull the bad posts, clean the holes, set new cedar, re-stretch the wire. His hands knew the work well enough that his mind could wander while he did it, which he preferred. He thought about things. He noticed things. He was the kind of man who filed observations away without knowing why, and then found out why later. On the 3rd day, he reached the eastern fence line. He pulled the first post out of the damaged section and set it aside, and then his post hole digger hit something solid about 18 inches down that wasn't rock. He reached in with his hand and found the edge of what felt like fitted stone. He got down on his knees and started clearing dirt with his fingers. It was a chamber. Small, no bigger than a shoebox, lined with flat stones fitted together without mortar, like someone had taken time and thought about the weight and the water, and the way the earth would shift over decades. It had held. The interior was dry. and sitting inside it, wrapped in waxed canvas that had gone dark with age and compression, was a package the size of a thick envelope. Wyatt sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. The prairie wind moved through the grass around him. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere to the south. Somewhere behind him, a meadowlark started up and then went quiet. He picked up the package and turned it over in his hands. It was light. He could feel something stiff inside. Papers, maybe. The waxed canvas was tied with cord that had dried and contracted until it was almost fused to itself. He didn't open it. Not yet. He set it carefully on the tailgate of his truck and went back to the post hole. He moved to the next post, pulled it, reached down, another chamber, another package. He stood up straight and looked down the fence line. There were 40-some posts in this eastern section, running about 300 yards along the property boundary. He walked to the next post, the one after that, and the one after that, rocking each one in the ground to feel whether it was solid or whether there was something underneath shifting the set. Most were firm. A few had a quality he couldn't quite describe. Not loose, not hollow, but somehow not as rooted as they should have been. He went back to the beginning and started pulling them in order. 7 posts, 7 chambers, 7 packages. By the time he found the last one, the afternoon light was going long and orange across the grass, and Wyatt Mercer was no longer thinking about the fence. He carried all 7 packages to his truck and drove back to his trailer on the eastern edge of Garnet Creek. He ate leftover chili standing at the kitchen counter, barely tasting it, and then sat down at his table with the packages arranged in front of him in the order he'd found them. He cut the cord on the first one carefully and peeled back the waxed canvas. Inside was a folded paper, brittle at the creases but intact. He unfolded it slowly. It was a hand-drawn map, detailed, careful, annotated in a tight, controlled handwriting. It showed property boundaries, the Harmon Ranch, the land to the east, what was labeled as the original corridor access. There were measurements noted in chains and links, which was the old surveying notation, the kind that had been standard before GPS and digital equipment made everything easier and less precise. At the bottom of the map, a date. September 14th, 1962. Wyatt opened the second package. More documents. These were older and more formal. What looked like a partial copy of an original land survey, stamped with a county seal that was too faded to read clearly. He could make out sections of the legal description, the metes and bounds language that defined property lines in terms of compass bearings and distances from fixed points. Several lines had been underlined in pencil by whoever had hidden this. The underlined portions described the eastern boundary of what was identified as the Harmon property. He kept going. Third package, handwritten notes, several pages, in the same tight script as the map annotations. He read slowly, parsing the old-fashioned phrasing. The line is surveyed in 1947 runs from the old cottonwood at the creek bend, bearing due east for a distance of 41 chains to the corner marker stone, thence south 23 degrees for 18 chains to the second corner, thence bearing west to the creek. This line was never in dispute until 1958. What happened in 1958 is what I am setting down here. Wyatt set down the page and rubbed his eyes. He was a fence builder. He knew property lines the way a carpenter knows lumber. Not theoretically, but in his hands and his gut, in the way his eye tracked a line across terrain and told him whether it was straight or whether something was off. He had pulled fence posts across half of Wyoming and Montana. He had reset boundary markers that had heaved out of the ground. He had, more than once, discovered that a fence was standing somewhere it had no business standing. But he had never found anything like this. He opened the rest of the packages over the next 2 hours, spreading the contents across his kitchen table until there was no room left and he had to move his coffee cup to the counter. What emerged, piece by piece, was a picture. In 1947, the original survey of the Harmon property established a clear eastern boundary. That boundary included access to a cattle corridor, a strip of land about 60 feet wide that ran along the eastern edge of the property, connecting the Harmon Ranch to grazing commons further north. At the time, this access was critical. Without it, moving cattle from the Harmon property to the northern range required a 3-mile detour around private land, which added hours to every drive and wore the animals down. In 1958, according to the handwritten notes, something changed. A man named Elias Crow, who had purchased the land to the east in 1955, began making claims that the boundary survey was incorrect. He disputed the location of the corner marker. He said the old cottonwood that served as the reference point had been on his land, not the Harmon land. He hired his own surveyor, or someone who claimed to be a surveyor, who produced documents supporting Crow's version. The notes describe what followed: arguments, a failed attempt at mediation, a county records dispute that dragged on for years. And then, at some point in the early 1960s, the fence along the eastern boundary of the Harmon property was physically moved. Not by much. The handwritten notes estimated 20 to 30 yards, but enough to exclude the cattle corridor. The new fence placement, once it was in the ground and had stood for a few seasons, began to be treated as the de facto boundary line. The hidden documents in the fence posts were someone's attempt to preserve the truth. The original survey, the original measurements, evidence that the fence had been moved and by how much and when. Whoever had hidden them had been careful and systematic. They had built chambers designed to survive decades of frost and soil movement. They had sealed the documents against moisture. They had placed them in the fence posts at regular intervals, as though they understood that any one cache might be disturbed, but the full truth would survive if it was distributed and hidden. And they had never come back for them. Or if they had come back, they had found the fence still standing and had left the evidence in place, waiting for something. Wyatt sat at his kitchen table for a long time after he finished reading. The trailer was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving against the aluminum walls, with a sound like something asking to be let in. He thought about what he was holding. He thought about who might have hidden it and why they had never used it. He thought about the Harmon property and the Dillard family, who had bought Elias Crow's land sometime in the 90s and had been ranching it since, using that eastern corridor as their own. He thought about what it meant if those documents were accurate. The cattle corridor on the eastern boundary of the Harmon property, currently fenced off, currently part of what everybody in the county accepted as Dillard land, might not legally belong to the Dillards at all. It might belong to whoever owned the Harmon property. It might now belong to Margaret Voss. Wyatt was back on the property at dawn the next morning, before the light was fully up, with a longer pry bar and a more systematic approach. He went back to the beginning of the eastern fence line and worked every post, not just the ones that had visible damage. He was looking for chambers, and now that he knew what he was looking for, he found 3 more that he'd missed the first time. Smaller caches, tucked under posts that were still solid enough to feel normal to a casual inspection. 2 of the additional caches contained more survey fragments, cross-referencing the original 1947 measurements with detailed notes about the specific marker stones that had been set at the time. One of them contained something that stopped him cold. What appeared to be a partial transcript of a county records hearing from 1961, handwritten but formatted like an official document, signed at the bottom by someone whose name was partially obscured by a water stain. The testimony described a man, identified only by his initials, EC, admitting in a private conversation that the corner marker had been moved, not by a surveying error, by hands, deliberately moved. Wyatt photographed everything with his phone before he packed the additional documents with the others. He wasn't sure exactly what he had yet, not in legal terms, not in terms of what could actually be proven or acted on, but he understood the shape of what had happened, and the understanding settled in his chest like a stone. Somebody had stolen this land, and whoever had known about it had hidden the proof in a fence line and then, for reasons Wyatt couldn't know yet, had left it there for decades, buried under the prairie, waiting. He made one mistake that second morning. It wasn't a bad mistake, not in hindsight, but it was the kind of thing that happens when you're not paying enough attention to who might be watching. He had the post puller running, working a section near the fence's southern corner where it met the Dillard boundary at a right angle, when he heard a truck on the access road that ran along the east side of the property. He didn't think much of it at first. People used that road. But the truck slowed and stopped, and when he glanced over, he saw it idling about 50 yards off, a dark blue F-250 with a Dillard Ranch decal on the door panel. 2 men inside. He couldn't see their faces clearly from that distance, but one of them had a window rolled down, and they were looking at him the way men look at something that concerns them. He kept working. He didn't make a show of noticing them. After about 4 minutes, the truck moved on. But that evening, when he stopped for gas at the Sulphur Creek station on his way home, the attendant, a kid named Travis, who Wyatt had hired to help on a post job the previous summer, leaned against the pump and said, almost conversationally, "Heard you're working the old Harmon place." Word travels. Wyatt said. Roy Dillard was in here earlier, mentioned it. Travis kept his eyes on the pump numbers. Said he hoped whoever was out there wasn't getting too curious about the